In this video, we're going to take a look at the ZBrush interface as a whole. Now, you might be tempted to skip this chapter, but I highly recommend that you take a look at this, especially if you're a brand new user to ZBrush. I consider this a demystification process where we can look at the interface, which looks not like any other program that you may have experienced, and we can demystify just how complicated it might appear on first glance. It's actually not that complex. ZBrush is a very fluid and very sensible way of interfacing with the program. You just have to understand where you go for what options. And most importantly, I think, what options that you never need to use, because there are menus here which you will never use and some that you will very rarely use. And I think by going through and seeing exactly which menu we're going to actually be using and what they do, it will help you create a basis and a sense of confidence where you can then carry on and really understand the logic behind ZBrush, because it appears to have a steep learning curve when in fact it doesn't. I've been teaching ZBrush for over a decade, and consistently I've seen that the learning curve appears very intimidating. However, it's far shorter than you think once you get past that initial hump of the interface. And once that's been demystified, you can start to problem solve and understand how to approach your models and textures. Any operation you need to do in ZBrush, you can start to work out new ways to approach it because you have a solid understanding of the interface itself. So to begin, we have a Z tool loaded up on screen in edit mode. Many of these things you'll already know from this quick start tutorial. The tool menu is on the right side, and we're going to begin by going counterclockwise and explore the entire interface. We're going to begin with the left-hand bar. This is the palettes. These are all these big buttons opening up palettes for various things that we can access inside of ZBrush. So by default, it should look something like this, standard brush with a dot stroke. The first palette here is the brush palette, and this allows you to access all of your different brushes. If I were to press the B hotkey, that brings up that brush palette wherever I happen to be on screen. Now, the next palette down is the stroke palette. The stroke palette controls how the brushes are applied to the surface. Think of this left-hand side as an artist who has her palettes in her left hand and her brush in her right. So you come over here and you can select your palette, whatever tool or alpha or stroke you want to use, and then you start to apply it to your canvas on screen. So returning to the dot stroke, if we roll around to the clean part of the model, you can see the dot stroke basically creates a freehand stroke on the model. If I were to change this to freehand, it's very, very similar. It's hard to kind of see what's happening here if we don't have a directional alpha selected. Alphas are the next palette down. Alphas allow you to access all the different grayscale images which are loaded into ZBrush, which can be used as brush tips. Alphas also serve other purposes. You can use them to make geometry, and you'll see that in a later video. But for the most part, we just use them as brush tips, very similar to Photoshop. So if I were to select Alpha 10, the star alpha, and then change or stay on the dot stroke, you see it's drawing instances of that star so close together they appear to be one continuous stroke. Now if I change my stroke to freehand, you see it's pretty much the same, but if we go to drag rectangle drags out instances of that alpha as almost like a texture stamp. So I can stamp that alpha on, just like so. If I hold down the Alt key, it subtracts. So again, the alphas simply serve as the shape of your brush, and the stroke serves as the manner in which that brush is applied to the surface. If I go to spray, I can spatter those stars all over the surface. And there's a limited number of options here under the stroke menu. I can change things like flow and placement. If I turn placement up, it increases the spread. And these settings here are also available in the top menu up here under stroke. And here you have far more options to adjust your strokes. This is true of everything in the ZBrush interface. Everything you see on screen right now is cloned from the top menus. This is sort of the core of ZBrush, this top set of menus. And everything you see down here is cloned out of those menus. I'll show you that again later, especially when we're looking at the brush controls. What's important to understand is the most commonly used options you're going to be able to access directly from the palettes. For example, import and export. You can also, if you go to the brush palette, you can load brushes and save them out. You can insert mesh brushes. Most of the most important operations you can access directly from the palettes. The more in-depth operations, you have to go to the menu of origin. So continuing on, we have the texture menu. Texture palette, we'll talk about when we do textures. This is how we load textures into ZBrush. We can use these as textures, as reference images. We can also use them for HDR rendering. So anytime we want to bring an image into ZBrush, a color image, we will bring it into the texture palette. Now we have the material menu. In the material palette, it shows you all the different materials that are currently loaded into ZBrush that you can select. So if I change to red wax shader, it changes the material on my object. I can change to the flat color material, which strips out all the shading information and just gives me flat color. This is actually a very useful material for texture painting. So here I can select any material that I want. My personal preference is basic material 2. And the reason my ZBrush always starts with that basic material 2 is because under the material palette, I can set my startup material. So if you click that, whatever current material is selected will be the default material every time you start. The next palette down is the color palette. Here I can select color, and we're going to use that in far more depth when we do painting. We can set gradient colors by turning this on and off, and we have our 2 active color swatches, main and secondary. Again, these are only going to come into play when we're texture painting. There's a switch color button, which switches between those 2. Alternate colors by Alt key, and then there's the show thumbnail button that turns that thumbnail on and off. The thumbnail view, of course, is here. If I click and drag that, I can open it and expand it. The thumbnail view is very useful. It allows you to see your character in silhouette, and that's just a fundamental of design. As we're working, not only do we want to be concerned with the internal forms and the sculpture, we want to consider how the overall silhouette or the first read appears. It's an important aspect of design, and this is very, very useful to have on screen, especially in the preliminary stages of a sculpture when you're just trying to establish your overall silhouettes and shapes. This thumbnail view allows us to always see very clearly as I'm changing the model. You see those changes update in that silhouette view, in that thumbnail view. So it's a very, very powerful, very useful design tool that I think if you have not worked with thumbnails before, you will find that this is very beneficial by getting into that mindset of always being aware not only of the internal forms, but the overall silhouette. I can click and drag to reduce that, or I can turn it off completely. Now, here we've got the navigation bust. If I click and drag that, it'll snap by degrees in rotation on all the different axes. And of course, I can use the shortcuts here to snap to view. Now we come to the right sidebar. The right sidebar is mostly navigation with a few other utilities. The top button here is BPR, that's Best Preview Render. That's the best render available inside of ZBrush. Of course, there's other options. You can render outside of ZBrush, and ZBrush does link directly to Keyshot, so you can use the Keyshot bridge with ZBrush to render in Keyshot. Beneath that, we have our subpix, so that's just the anti-aliasing quality. Now these buttons here are for navigating the document. So if I scroll, it moves the document around. Zoom zooms the document. Actual size makes it its actual resolution that's found here under the document window. And AAA half is anti-alias half. It half sizes it and anti-aliases it. We very really need to use these. You don't want to navigate the document. You want to make sure you're navigating the object itself. So I leave it at actual size and then navigate around the object. Now if we're zoomed in and we want to rotate, there is this bar that goes around the perimeter of the document. If I click inside that, I can navigate by clicking there if my model fills the entire screen. Whereas if I click on the model, you're going to affect the model rather than navigate. Press the F key to refocus the model on screen. Next down we have perspective. So if I press the P key, I can turn perspective on and off. And this is just the button that does that. Now things like this, perspective, these are actually found under the draw menu. So there's the perspective button there. And if you watch as I mouse over it, it lights up out there in the interface. And that's kind of what I was talking about, that all these buttons are cloned out of these main menus at the top of the screen. So right out of the gate, ZBrush appears to have more things going on in it than it actually does. You might think that these are all separate options, but all these buttons are the most important and most commonly used tools that we're going to find in places like the brush menu, the draw menu, or the tool menu. Next, we have the floor plane. The floor plane is nice to turn on if you want to get oriented around your model. We can see our axis here. There's the XYZ axis. We can also turn on the X grid and the Z grid like that. So we have 3 different grids, but typically we just have Y turned on for the floor plane. If we have the floor plane turned on when we render, we will actually cast a shadow on it. So that's something that's important to keep in mind as well. And that's only because we have the floor plane turned on. The next button down is local symmetry. Local symmetry allows symmetry to be calculated based on the center line of the model, not the origin in the world. So this is a symmetrical mesh, but if I turn off symmetry and move it off center, and then turn symmetry back on, you'll see that it's still working. If I turn off local symmetry, there we go. I had to zoom out a bit for that to work. Now you see it's no longer working. That's because local symmetry, it's determined, if local symmetry is not turned on, it's determining the center by the center of the grid. If we turn it on, it's determining the center based on the center line of the model itself. So let's return that to the origin and turn off local symmetry. This button locks the camera. This is very handy, I find, when I'm texturing, or if I'm sculpting on the edge of an object. I'll lock the camera, and now I can no longer click and drag on the background to rotate. So now I can grab the move tool and start moving the perimeter of the mesh, and it's not going to allow me to start rotating the model instead of sculpting on the edge. If I unlock the camera, then I can change my perspective again. Here we have the rotation. Basically, we're always going to be on XYZ, all axes. It just controls the axis that you're able to actually rotate around. We can confine it to Z-axis or Y-axis, but that's very rarely used. Typically, I find I'm always on XYZ. Next, we have the frame button that turns on the recentering of the object. So if I am off screen and press the F key, it will reframe and recenter the model. Here we have move, zoom, and rotate. Now these are for navigating the model. Move moves the model around, zoom zooms it in and out, and rotate rotates it. The only time I would ever use these is if I'm working with a very, very large document and it's too slow to navigate on screen. I highly recommend that you do not rely on these for navigation. Learn the navigation shortcuts, which are in the Quick Start tutorial. That is Alt, click, and drag to move, click and drag on the background to rotate, Alt, click and press down with your tablet pen, then let go of Alt and drag to zoom. Now you can also click with your Wacom button on your pen and drag to rotate, Alt, click to zoom. But it's very, very, very important, I think, to understand the navigation and not rely on those buttons, because you'll slow yourself down by going over to the side of the screen instead of just working with the navigation right there in the document window. That's just extra time, and it's not worth it. Next down we have polyframe mode. That shows us the polygons and the polygroups. So if I have polygroups on our model, we'll see them here as color coding. I can turn off lines if I just want to see the color coding, and I can turn off color if I just want to see the polygons. Next we have transparency. Now this is for subtools. Here I have 2 subtools for the eyes. If I turn on transparency and ghost, I'll be able to see through those subtools, and I can see through to the eyeballs inside the mesh. Ghost is the type of transparency that's using. If I turn it off, you see it slightly alters the transparency style. Solo will isolate whatever my currently selected subtool is. Lastly, we have expose. If I click that, it will expose the various subtools. Click it again, and it brings everything back together. That can be really useful if you have a model with a whole bunch of different subtools and maybe you're trying to find one particular part. You can spread them all out using that button. So that completes the right-hand bar. So we've seen the left-hand bar and the right-hand bar and what all these options actually do. This is called the right-hand dock. This is where we can dock menus from the top of the screen here. Right now we have the tool menu docked. There's this little radio button here. If I click that, it actually closes that menu. If I double click the two arrows there, it closes the entire dock and gives me more workspace. Double click those again and it opens the dock. And if I come back up here and click that radial button on any of these menus, I can click or drag that and it will place it on the right hand side. Or I can click and drag and manually dock like that. If I double click the name of the menu, it will collapse. If I click the little radio button again, it removes the menu entirely. Now there is a right side dock and there is a left hand dock. If I double click here, you see there's an entire different one. So oftentimes I may have two different menus open. Perhaps I'll put the brush menu on the left hand side by clicking and dragging, and that menu is now docked on the left hand side. I can collapse it, and then again, regain more screen real estate. So the right hand dock is where we're going to have our currently active menu that we're going to the most often. Now moving up to the upper portion of the screen here, the top bar, here we have the home page. Here with the light box. Now the light box is typically open by default when you load Zbrush. The light box is just a file browser. It allows you to bring in any type of file that you can save out of Zbrush. That includes brushes, textures, Z-tools. Sometimes it takes a little time for those to load. Projects. Here we have a variety of different projects that we can access inside of Zbrush. We have our most recent files here. We have materials. Now these materials are different, and these tools are different, and these brushes are different than the ones we find in the palettes. These are not currently loaded into Zbrush. The Lightbox is a file browser. It basically looks in the Zbrush install folder and allows you to load in files from there. So inside the Zbrush load folder, you're going to find a variety of brushes which are not loaded by default. And they may just be variations or specialty brushes that you don't necessarily want to have all the time. So I can go in here and I can grab some variation of the layer brush, for example, or I can go to the planar brushes and I'll find some variations on the planar brushes. If I want to load a brush from here, I simply select it, double click it, and it loads it into Zbrush. And that is now in the brush palette. Were I to restart Zbrush, this brush would no longer be loaded because Zbrush only loads those brushes which are set to load by default. The ones in the light box are simply there so we can access them as we want them and load them then. Here we have alphas, materials. We have various noises for the noise maker, fibers for fiber mesh, arrays, various grids. We have render sets for non-photorealistic rendering. We have various filters, which we can access here for NPR rendering, non-photorealistic rendering. We have our quick save. Now, quick save happens while you're working in Zbrush. It will automatically save your work. You can also manually quick save by clicking this button here, and it will create a new quick save, an incremented quick save file in the quick save folder. And if I want to manually open a file, I just click Open File and I can open it there. Next we have Live Boolean. Live Boolean we'll talk about in more depth in the Boolean chapter, but this is typically used for hard surface, but it does have other uses as well. It simply turns on Live Boolean so it functions. Now here we have the most important aspect of the top menu. We have Edit Mode. Now when we load a model into ZBrush, you know that we press the T key to go into edit mode. That's very, very important. If we don't do that, then we're just going to keep drawing the model on the screen. I'll show you what I mean by that. I'm going to exit out of edit mode and clear the canvas. Now I'm going to start drawing a model on the canvas. I've got my bust loaded up here. If I click and drag, it draws it on screen, but I don't enter edit mode and I just keep clicking and dragging. It just draws instance after instance on screen. That's because the ZBrush canvas, the window we're sculpting in, is a 2.5D illustration panel. This was used many, many years ago for illustration in ZBrush, and that's why we're able to drop models onto it. If you have a situation like this where you have something stuck on your screen, press Control N for new and that clears the canvas. Draw the model on screen, press the T key, which is just like pressing the edit button here. Any button here in ZBrush that has a hotkey will give you the hotkey in the tooltip. So there's T for edit. Now immediately we go into perspective, my cursor turns red, and I'm able to sculpt. Here we have draw. Draw just means that we're in sculpt mode. That's different from move, scale, and rotate, which brings up the gizmo here, which allows us to move, scale, and rotate the object itself. So if I turn off X symmetry, you can see that we can scale this, we can rotate it, and we can move. The hotkeys for there are W, E, and R. Now, I'm using the gizmo for this, but if I turn the gizmo button off, this turns into a transpose line. We talk about transpose in the transpose chapter, but it's important to know that if you want to access the transpose line, simply turn off gizmo and that will bring it up. Next, we have Sculptress Pro Mode. Sculptress Pro Mode is just a method of sculpting that tessellates your mesh as you're sculpting. We have a chapter specifically dedicated to that as well. It's something that we may not use often, but it's very important to know how to use it. So going back to draw, you can see that we have all these brush controls here. These are all coming from the multiple places. First off, these first menu buttons here are coming from the transform menu. Draw, move, scale, and rotate. You see they light up in the interface. Again, these are just clones of things that come out of the top menu bar. If I go to I go to the draw menu, you can see that we have our draw size, focal shift, Z intensity. All these sliders are just cloned out of the main menu. So basically, everything you see up here is just making it easier on you so you don't have to go seek things out in the interface depths. You can just find them on screen where you need them. We have the ability to paint with an alpha. We can turn that on and off. Here we have mRGB, RGB, and M, Z-add and Z-sub. This is what controls what our brush is doing. My brush right now, I'm going to change to the standard brush, reset it to its original settings. By default, I have it set to paint with alpha and it's set to Z-add. If I set it to Z-sub, this is what happens. As I stroke on the model, it subtracts. Now, I never change any of my brushes to Z-sub or Z-add because if you press the Alt key, it will always do the opposite of its default setting. So I find it easier to leave the brush as it is and hold Alt when I want to subtract. Now, as I'm painting, or as I'm sculpting, if I turn on M, it will not only sculpt, but it'll also add material. So let's fill this with material. I've got the gray shade material on, so I will go to Color, Fill Object. And because I have M turned on, it will fill the material channel. So if I change my material now, we won't see it change on the model because I filled the material channel with the gray material. But I have material turned on my brush and I have a new material selected, so as I'm sculpting, ZBrush paints material as well as sculpting. Now if I turn on RGB, ZBrush will paint as I sculpt. If I turn off sculpt, it will just paint. We'll see that in more detail in our painting video. What I'll do is I will turn on RGB, go to Color, Fill Object. That fills the object, the RGB channel, with that color white. So now if I change to a different color and start sculpting, you can see that it's adding color along with the sculpting strokes. Lastly, we have mRGB. That adds color and material at the same time. So it's adding both the wax shader and the blue color. Typically, we leave our brushes at their default settings unless we're going in for painting. If we have RGB turned on, you'll notice that we can control the RGB intensity with this slider. With Z-add, we have the Z intensity slider. This controls the relative strength of the brush. If I turn it all the way up, it's very strong. If I turn it quite low, it's very, very weak. Let's get it a little bit, there we go. Next we have Remember Draw Size per Brush. If we turn this on, if I set my draw size for my standard brush to be about so, that's my standard brush draw size. But then I change the inflate brush, you see it's changed the draw size. Go back to standard, it's remembered its draw size. Go to inflate, maybe I'll make the inflate really tiny. Go to standard, go back to inflate. So all of my brushes will remember their individual draw sizes with that button turned on. Focal shift and draw size. Draw size is the overall size of the brush. Focal shift changes that inner circle. That's the fall off of the brush, the fall off of the alpha actually. So we adjust that like so. Now here We lastly have active points and total points. This is very useful for understanding how dense the model currently is. Now these sliders up here are really useful, but I don't recommend trying to access them there. As I'm sculpting, I always press the spacebar. The spacebar brings up this quick menu, which gives me access to my draw size, focal shift, Z intensity, and all those other options. Now you could also press things like the S key for just draw size, or if you go to Z intensity, that's the U hotkey. Press the U key, that brings up your Z intensity. So it's up to you what you find to be the most comfortable to use. Personally, I prefer to use the spacebar, but you could also use those individual hotkeys. And as you mouse over the sliders, it will tell you what those hotkeys are. So those are the left and right sidebar, the docks, and the top bar menu. So already you're seeing that these are the most commonly used bits and pieces inside of the interface. Now let's take a look at the top menu and see what we're actually going to use at its core. The alpha menu we will use. We use this menu to adjust the grayscale images that we bring into Zbrush. Maybe we want to turn them into brushes, maybe we want to turn them into geometry. This is the menu that's used with some regularity. The brush menu is used to hack your brushes. You get into all the nitty-gritty settings of your brushes, like auto masking, and you can adjust the various types of controls like backface masking. Turn on backface masking, that protects the backside of thin meshes. Cavity masking will mask the recesses of a model from our stroke. We can also do topological masking. These are all things that we talk about in the brush chapter. The color menu, really we don't come into this very often because it's just the color palette with a few other options like system palette and fill object. So it's pretty self-explanatory and not a very complicated menu. The document menu you won't find yourself using very often because a very common mistake for new ZBrush users is to save a document instead of a Z tool. So you always want to save your tool by going to Tool, Save As, or go to File, Save As, and that will save as a project. File, Save As is a project. The Draw menu gives you many more options for things like the camera and the grids. We do use this menu, especially when we want to access our camera settings. It's basically just a way to give you further and deeper controls over the grids, the cameras, and some brush options here. We don't use it a lot, but we do use it. The edit menu is not quite so important. It's mainly just Control Z, your undos, and you can, of course, also trim your undo history here. You can use delete older undo history here, so you can delete your previous undos. The file menu here, this is something that we use, but we don't go to it often because Control S is the hotkey that accesses the most important menu option there, which is File, Save As. Now here's where it gets interesting. The layer menu we don't use. This is a legacy menu. This is for 2.5D illustration layers. Now ZBrush does paint and sculpt in layers, but you do not use the layer menu for this. For this, we go to the tool menu and open layers here. And this is where we do our painting and sculpting layers under the tool menu. So don't get confused and use this layer menu here because that does not work with our 3D models. The light menu is just for adjusting our lighting. So we will come in here, especially when we're doing renders or movies. It's pretty self-explanatory. We do light caps and we can adjust some shadow settings in here, but it's mainly about adjusting and placing lighting within our scene. The macro menu allows you to record a series of actions inside of ZBrush and then play them back, much like you might do in Microsoft Word. This is essentially a way of Z-scripting without having to code. Now here we have the marker menu. This is another menu that's defunct. We don't use this menu anymore. The multi-markers predate subtools, and it used to be a way of locking two different tools together, but it's not something that we have to use anymore, so we really never touch this menu. The material menu is where we go to control our material settings. So if I open the basic material, which is the startup material, so we'll select that again. Now if I go to the material menu and open up modifiers, I can change things like the specular. I can turn that up. Maybe I want to adjust the specular curve. Make sure we're on the basic material too. There we go. Now you can see that will respond to the changes. So as I change the sliders and adjust the curve, it will change the specular component of that material. The movie palette, we will use this when we want to do our timeline for animation, or to store model positions. We also do turntables in here and different types of movies that we can render out of ZBrush. We have a chapter dedicated to this, so I encourage you to watch that to learn how to render your own turntables and animations in ZBrush. The picker palette is generally used when we're hacking the nitty-gritty of a brush. This is a very advanced customized brush setting. It just controls how the brush interacts with the surface as you stroke along it. If the brush orients once when you first click, or if it continually reorients as you draw along the surface. It's all quite advanced and not something that most people ever access, even advanced power users. It's mainly about hacking brushes and creating very, very specific types of custom brushes. The preference menu is like any other preferences menu. This is where we go to change our preferences for the various aspects of the interface. Most importantly, I think we have our import-export preferences here. Transpose units are very useful. We have all our different options here for exporting from ZBrush. And again, this is a very important menu, but it is rather self-explanatory. It's like you find in any other program. Next, we have the render menu. The render menu allows us to control our render settings. So remember when we did our BPR render, I'm going to adjust my specular again. I don't want it to be so plastic looking. So if I do a BPR render, you'll notice the shadows are very hard. Let's change that eyeball color back to white. If we go into our render menu, we can control things like BPR shadow. If I change the angle slider, I can soften the shadow edge. So if I render once again, after making that change, you see I have control over the softness of the edge of the shadows. And we'll talk about this in more depth in a later chapter, but I just wanted you to understand why we go here. The stencil menu isn't quite used so much anymore. Alphas can be turned into stencils, which we can use for painting, just like you would spray paint through a cardboard stencil. Typically, this has been supplanted by Spotlight and the Spotlight tools, so it's very rare that we actually use the stencil menu anymore. The stroke menu, we've already seen, it just gives us further and deeper control over the stroke palette. We can control Lazy Mouse, we can control Sculptris Pro. So we will use this menu with some regularity. The texture menu allows us to control the textures that we've brought into ZBrush. If you want to change their orientation or add them to Spotlight, this is where we'll do that. And again, we'll talk about this in more depth in our texturing chapters. Of course, the tool menu. The tool menu is the workhorse menu of ZBrush. This is the main menu that you're going to spend most of your time in when you're working on a Z tool. This allows you to access your subtools, your layers. If you want to change your geometry settings, you can do that here. If you want to access your fiber mesh settings, surface noise, all these different things, anything that applies directly to this Z tool, you will find under the tool menu. Now we have the transform menu, which everything that is really important in here, you're already going to find docked outside in the main interface where we've already seen it. The majority of what's important is already docked outside, so we come here often except maybe to access our symmetry controls. That's the X key for activate symmetry, but here we can change the symmetry axis and we can turn on radial symmetry as well as posable symmetry, all things that we will talk about later. So the transform menu is useful, but it's not one that you find yourself using an awful lot. Lastly, we have the Z plugin menu. Z plugin allows you to access all the plugins for ZBrush. This includes the ones that are loaded by default, as well as plugins that you've loaded independently. If you check out ZBrush Central, you'll find many plugins there as well. And that's the last menu we actually use. The next is ZScript. Now, unless you're actually doing ZScripting, you won't use that. And the help menu, we really don't use very often, but you can see that this is where you can access things like ZBrush Central, the online documentation, and the Pixologic support room. ZBrush Live, it's nice to go on there, and I have a couple videos on there if you want to go watch artists working live or pre-recordings of artists working live. Now at the very, very top, we have our version, our file, our free memory, our active memory, scratch disk space. We also have our polygon count, and as you've already seen, our quick save button. We can also adjust our transparency of the interface as a whole by adjusting that slider. And we can reset our interface by moving between the interface colors and the interface itself using these buttons here. And that is the ZBrush interface. That has hopefully demystified it for you. I hope this helps clarify how many things you're actually going to use and how many things you're not going to use within the program. And I hope it makes it feel less imposing. So you've already done the quick start tutorial, so you really have a solid basis of the most important aspects of ZBrush. But as you step back and look at the interface as a whole, I hope it helps you see how everything you see on screen around the perimeter, it's just there to simplify and speed up your workflow because it all comes out of those top menus there. It just makes your life easier so you don't have to keep going back and forth. So that concludes this video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.